So how do you know what the speed limit is? It should be obvious, right? You just look at the signs and you know what the speed limit is. But experience shows that on driving tests, many learners fail their driving test because they're not aware of the speed limit and either end up going too fast or too slow for the piece of road that they're on. And in fact, when you look at experienced drivers, you can see the same sort of thing. They do tend to get speeding fines, not necessarily because they're planning to go too fast, but because they're unaware of the speed limit for the road that they're on. So what do we need to know about in order to get to grips with speed limits? The first and most important thing is to understand the difference between terminal signs and repeater signs. Terminal signs mark the changes in speed limit, the end of one limit and the start of the next. They're quite large signs. They're the same size as normal informational warning signs that you'll see on the road, and they always occur in pairs, one on the left-hand side of the road and one on the right-hand side of the road. The repeater signs are quite a bit smaller than the terminal signs, and they are used when you're within a speed limit to remind you periodically as to what the speed limit is. And they usually come on their own, so there's usually only one sign, but it could be either side of the road, so either on the left or the right-hand side of the road. And remember that the speed limit changes at the terminal sign. So if you are going from a higher speed limit to a lower speed limit, you need to be at the lower speed by the time you get to the terminal sign. Likewise, if you're going from a lower speed limit to a higher speed limit, you can't speed up until you've got to the terminal sign and have entered the new speed limit. So spotting a change in speed limit should be easy. There's a pair of big signs to look out for that tell you that the speed limit is changing. The trouble is there's a couple of problems that you'll encounter from time to time. The first big problem is that signs can either go missing or they can get covered up by vegetation, which is quite common, especially in summer as plants tend to grow. But that said, on a driving test, if both signs are either covered up or missing, the examiner will advise you as to the change in speed limit. They're not trying to catch you out, and if it's impossible for you to know that the speed limit is changing, they will let you know. A second problem that you'll come across is that speed limits often change at junctions and roundabouts where two roads come together. And as a result, especially on a driving test, you'll be very focused on negotiating the junction safely and correctly, and it's very easy to overlook a change in speed limit that occurs either as you approach the junction or as you leave the junction. So let's take a quick look at an example of how easy it is to miss a speed limit change. Here we are approaching a side road on the left to turn into a road called Upton Lane. And as you can see, even though we're quite close to the junction at the moment, we still can't see any evidence of a change in speed limit. So let's move a little bit closer again, and now we can start to see the speed limit change sign coming in on the right hand side of the road to tell you that the new road is national speed limit. The old road, by the way, is 30 miles an hour, so it's quite a big change in speed limit. The trouble is that if you're turning left, your eyes are naturally going to be drawn to the left hand edge of the road, because you're trying to make sure you negotiate the corner safely without clipping the edge of the road. So it would be very easy to miss the terminal sign on the right hand side. And if we go a little bit closer again, now we can start to see that terminal sign coming in on the left hand side of the road as well. But at say 10 to 15 miles an hour, the kind of speed that you'll probably be turning into a side road at, it would be very easy to miss this sign because you've only got maybe 1 or 2 seconds to notice it while you're busy trying to track your way around the corner. And as you can also see, there's quite a few trees and bushes around it, so in summer it's not surprising if it gets a little bit covered up by foliage as well. And I chose this example for a reason. It's because it comes up on driving tests in Southampton, and this particular road, which is marked as national speed limit, it doesn't really look like a national speed limit road. It's quite a narrow country lane. So if you don't notice the terminal sign, it's then quite difficult. You wouldn't be expecting the road to be a faster road. So now you've got to rely on looking for things like streetlights, which we'll come back to in a moment. So if you miss a change in speed limit, it should be easy to update yourself just by looking out for repeater signs, and that will tell you what the current speed limit is, in theory. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. There's several problems. Firstly, speed limits on the repeater signs can easily get covered up by vegetation. Being that bit smaller than the terminal signs, it's much easier for them to disappear as foliage grows up in summer. And of course, because they're smaller and lighter, they are also somewhat easier for, how should we call them, mischievous miscreants to remove them on their way home from one of the local hostelries, for example, late at night. And they do go missing quite easily, so that can mean it is difficult to keep yourself up to date with the current speed limit. And on top of that, there's also the problem with the national speed limit system, and that comes down to how speed limits have evolved historically in this country. And in fact, we have two different sets of speed limit systems really, which sit on top of one another and make the whole system quite complicated to understand. The original modern speed limit system in this country just had a simple 30-mile-an-hour speed limit which applied in urban areas, and that was defined as areas with a system of street lighting. Outside of those areas, the roads were called de-restricted roads, where no speed limit applied. And the sign we used to denote the fact that the roads were de-restricted was a white circle with a black diagonal line across it. The sign that these days is known as the National Speed Limit Applies sign, but originally it meant de-restricted and no speed limit applied. And then from 1967 onwards, we introduced the national speed limit system. And what this meant was that we still had the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit applying on what were called restricted roads. Those were the roads in town with the system of street lighting. And then the roads which were originally de-restricted became a higher national speed limit, and it meant that either 60 miles an hour applied on single carriageway roads or 70 miles an hour applied on dual carriageway roads for cars. It's a bit different for other classes of vehicle, but we'll just concentrate on cars. So because restricted roads were defined in terms of roads which had a system of street lighting, it made it quite easy to work out whether the speed limit which was in application was either the 30 mile an hour speed limit or the 60 or 70 mile an hour speed limit that applied outside of urban areas. Because all you had to do was look to see whether there were streetlights. If there were streetlights present, you knew the speed limit was 30 miles an hour, and if there weren't, you knew the speed limit would either be 60 or 70, depending on whether you were on a single carriageway or a dual carriageway road. But then gradually other speed limits began to be introduced, and what this meant was that we needed a way of informing drivers when they're in a different speed limit to one of the national speed limits, what that speed limit was if they'd missed the terminal signs as they entered it. So that's how repeater signs came about. We started putting the smaller repeater signs in these other speed limits so you could keep yourself up to date with the speed limit as you travelled through them. So to summarise all that, in order to work out what your speed limit is, the first thing I would strongly recommend is keep on top of the terminal signs. Remember to look out for the changes in speed limit, particularly at junctions, and look both sides of the road, because there should always be two signs, one on each side. But if you haven't seen a speed limit sign, a speed limit change for a while, keep an eye out for the repeater signs as well, and they can be on either side of the road, so keep looking both sides so that you can keep on top of those. And if you haven't seen any kind of signage at all for a little while, then you need to start falling back on looking at the street lighting. Are there street lights there? In which case 30 mile an hour speed limit probably applies. And if there aren't any street lights, then if we haven't seen repeaters for a while, we would assume that the national speed limit of 60 miles an hour or 70 miles an hour, depending on whether it's a single carriageway or a dual carriageway, would apply. And as a little bit of a postscript, there's one other method you could use on a driving test quite often that will help you keep on top of the speed limits. And that's because for most driving tests, you'll be following the sat-nav in some part of the driving test to do your independent driving. And if the sat-nav is on, it will be displaying what it believes the speed limit currently is. It's not perfect because sometimes it can be wrong, either because updates haven't been downloaded onto it recently, or perhaps the speed limit has changed very recently and that hasn't simply got through to the sat-nav company yet. Or sometimes even it might be that they know about the speed limit, where the speed limit changes, but it's mapped slightly inaccurately. and so you can be travelling in one speed limit for a short distance while the sat-nav is displaying a different speed limit simply because its start point isn't quite in the right place. But it's a pretty good overall guide as to what the speed limit is. And then that can prompt you, if it seems to be different from what you'd expect, it can prompt you to look around and reassess your surroundings, look extra carefully for repeater signs, and thinking about whether the street lights are present or not to help you decide what you think the speed limit might be.